Hi everyone, my name is Brandon, and this week's module in Paris and Literature and Film, we will be discussing a novel written by Albert Camus, known as La Peste, also translated as The Plague. So for starters, I think it's very helpful to begin this conversation with this fundamental question. According to Camus, what does the plague symbolize in relation to the human condition, both historically and philosophically? And we will be revisiting this question throughout the presentation. Um, So moving forward, we will first discuss the life of Albert Camus, and then I will give you guys a brief summary of the novel itself, just to get you guys better acquainted with the plot. Then we'll discuss in more detail Camus' philosophy and his existentialism. And then finally, in relation to the novel itself, we'll discuss how these themes have greater implications for life in Paris in the 1940s. So Albert Camus was originally born in Algeria in 1913. He was educated formally at University of Algiers, but in 1940 he moved to Paris in order to pursue a career in writing. So far in the class, we've talked so much about how Paris has been such a cultural hub and a hotspot for artists and writers alike. But more specifically, during this time, Paris was facing war, World War II more specifically. And so this had actually fueled a lot of Albert Camus' writing, and we can see this in La Peste. La Peste was originally written and published in France in 1947. So during this time when he had moved to Paris was when he had begun work on this novel. This novel is actually his third to be published. Other works include L'Étangère and La Chute, his first and second novels. Um, and in conjunction with these two novels, this book that we're going to look more specifically at is reflects his existential philosophy, and it's a philosophy that in each work he is inventing and reinventing gradually. So in this part of the presentation, I just want to give you guys a brief summary of the novel. So Camus writes about this fictional city, Oran, that's situated in Algeria. And this city, which is very ordinary, ends up facing the threat of an epidemic outbreak. Its protagonist, Dr. Rieu, he actually is a physician, and he first notices dead rats spreading them around the city, but then eventually, as the rat population begins to die down, he sees an increasing number of sick patients. They're coming in with fevers and these horrible black spots, and that kind of tips him off that something's wrong. Eventually, it turns out to an all-out plague, and the city eventually has to go into a quarantine. As the city enters the quarantine, people begin to feel lonely and afraid. They can't see their loved ones. They can't leave the city, and then civil unrest begins to ensue, and the violence and looting just completely it just goes rampant throughout the city. The death toll increases, and eventually the people just lose hope altogether. But then in the end, the plague subsides and the gates reopen. And everyone returns to normal life. They end up rejoining with their loved ones. Even though the plague has virtually disappeared, it's still ever present and it hasn't really ever went away. So La Peste, or the plague, actually holds a double symbolism, and we will discuss this in the next few slides, both historically and philosophically, and how this ultimately has implications for what life was like in Paris during the 1940s. So, historically speaking, the plague, which Camus makes very apparent in chapter 5 of the novel, is actually representative of the war that's been going on in Paris. Um, World War II, more specifically. So, World War II originally started in 1939, but in 1940, Germany had finally invaded France and um, finally implicated them in the war and gave them a real reason to participate in World War II. Um, so German occupation had covered much of northern part of the country, and Paris itself had been overrun with Nazis. So the plague, in terms of it being somewhat of like a parasite that's been killing the people or the citizens of Wuhan, has reflective of the same parasitic nature of the Nazi regime operating in France during this time. Um, and so the plague actually is and also in a philosophical light, is also representative of the spread of fascism and the destruction of the Third Republic of France. So I believe that this quote in the novel is very representative of what's going on in Paris during this time. And it reads, Il y a eu dans le monde autant de peste que de guerre, et pourtant peste et guerre trouvent les gens toujours aussi dépourvus. And so this translates as there have been as many plagues as there have been wars in the world, and yet plagues and wars always seem to find people helpless or dejected, is another translation. Um, so essentially, this quote, how would you say, it brings together that idea, both internally in the novel and externally, of what's going on in Paris, that the spread of the plague, or in this case the Nazi regime, and the rise of fascism, is what is destroying the people. It's robbing them of hope, and it's making them feel just utterly dejected and lonely, and just it's instilled a lot of fear in the people of Paris and the people of France in general. And so Camus in this novel is trying to communicate that same sentiment through his characters and in the city of Oran. So what's interesting is that we can actually interpret this novel in a more philosophical light. So as some of you may or may not know, Albert Camus is what's known as an existential philosopher. Um, and existentialism is essentially like the study of being. And so he was writing, amongst other famed existentialists, for example, Kierkegaard, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir. They were all existentialists. Um, but more specifically, Camus believed in what's called an absurdist philosophy. So he suggested that death and suffering are inevitable consequences of living in a world devoid of meaning. And so, said another way, the world spins on its axis, and we suffer, and we live our lives, and eventually we die, and the world is completely indifferent to our pain and our suffering. And this is communicated through Camus' characters in La Peste. Um, he believes that neither science nor God will actually provide us with any recompense for the evils in this world. So, for instance, Father Panlou, he believes that the plague spreading in Oran is a consequence of the citizens' sinfulness, and so they must repent and turn to God, and that is what will save them from the plague. But for Dr. Rioux, he actually turns to science, and he tries to develop a sort of vaccine or an anti-plague serum in order to save the people of Wuhan. But in the end, both of them are essentially wrong, and they're both unsuccessful. In the end, the people suffer, thousands of people die in the city, and that's that. And so human pain and suffering actually go unnoticed by the world. And so for Albert Camus, humans actually have the responsibility to actively work to end suffering and fight against this evil. And that's what really brings meaning to their lives. So Camus writes, Mais ce qui est vrai des maux de ce monde est vrai aussi de la peste. Cela peut servir à grandir quelques-uns. Cependant, quand on voit la misère et la douleur qu'elle apporte, il faut être fou, aveugle, ou lâche, se résigner à la peste. And this translates as, but what is true of the evils of this world is also true of the plague. It may serve to elevate some, however, when one sees the misery and pain it brings, it would be foolish, blind, or cowardly to resign oneself to the plague. So what Camus is essentially trying to communicate is that it would be foolish to believe that there's some sort of meaning behind human suffering. And this is just simply the human condition that we suffer, and there isn't really a good explanation, whether that be from science or from God, about why we suffer and why we have to face such atrocities in our lives. And this could be reflective of the war that was going on. Um, but essentially for Camus, meaning is something that we have to fabricate for ourselves and invent for ourselves. And this is what gives us the responsibility to live, not only for ourselves as individuals, but also for others. So in reflection to both the historical and philosophical interpretations of the novel, I wanted you guys to reflect on some of these questions. So first of all, what does Camus' novel La Peste in its historical context say about Paris's resilience as a city? Two, reflect on your own personal philosophy. So in the face of evil, how does Camus' novel demonstrate the human struggle towards finding a cure for suffering in this world? And finally, which I think is a really interesting question, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this one. In a more modern context, like how does Camus' novel relate to us given our own experiences in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? And that's it. I hope you guys found this brief presentation to be informative, and I hope that it provides a lot more context for this week's reading of Camus' La Peste. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.